it's going to weaken the Russian propaganda line because all along, just a quick reminder, especially to the pro-Kremlin activists out there, Putin's play in February 2022 was that no one would come to the defense of Ukraine, that he would attack, he would break Ukraine within a few weeks, and the West would either choose not to help Ukraine or it would not it would not rally itself in time. He failed. He failed with that. But what he was thinking is, maybe I can do it in 2024. And symbolically, that US aid package, when it's probably signed by Joe Biden on Friday, is going to be a big defeat to that immediate ambition that Putin had.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by one of our regular guests here on Frontline, Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for letting me sneak back in.
Let's begin with the big story of the past week or so, which of course is Congress finally approving that $60 billion of military aid for Ukraine. What was it that broke the deadlock in Congress?
Because the House Speaker, a Republican named Mike Johnson, finally decided to stand up to the Trumpist and to the hard right Republicans and to allow a vote on this package after a 6.5-month blockade. Back last October, the Trumpist and the hard right effectively said we're not going to accept any further aid to Ukraine from the Biden administration. What gave them leverage is that at the same time, they forced out the House Speaker, a man named Kevin McCarthy. There was, for weeks, indecision amongst the Republicans. Finally, Johnson, who was relatively little known, was brought in as the Speaker, and his assent relied on the votes of the Trumpist and the hard right. So they almost had that on him. And Johnson himself, of course, who's trying to make his way in terms of where he is on U.S. foreign policy, may have actually, agreed in part with their position. Back in February, however, or around February, as it became clear that not only was Ukraine struggling to gain further ground, but that the Russians were about to take the town of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. This only the second town they've taken since July of 2022, but still significant that the Russians might be on the offensive in eastern Ukraine. The U.S. intelligence services and State Department briefed Johnson and other legislators and said, yeah, this is a serious issue here. Despite the fact that Ukraine has resisted the Russian invasion for more than 2 years, the Russians have a 7-to-1 advantage in artillery shells. Of course, they have a big advantage in manpower as well. They're using guided bombs on the front line. And of course, Russia at the same time was carrying out these missile and drone strikes to try to break Ukraine's energy infrastructure and to break civilian resistance. So Ukraine was under strain because of a shortage of artillery shells, because of a shortage of air defenses. And this was exacerbated by the blockade on aid. And Johnson kept getting those briefings. And so he began to swing, towards saying, well, okay, we'll have a vote. But the question was, are you going to vote on the full package that the U.S. Senate had adopted in mid-February, which included not only this aid to Ukraine, but aid to Israel, aid to Taiwan as well. And then the immediate catalyst was that the weekend before last, the Iranian attack, more than 320 missiles and drones on Israel. Now, that was a demonstration attack, largely a demonstration attack designed to cause very little damage. But of course, it made all the headlines that Iran had directly carried out this assault on Israel. And so that meant, of course, that the motive to adopt the military aid to Israel, almost $20 billion in the package, that had been reinforced. There is also, by the way, money for humanitarian aid in Gaza as well. But the Israel dynamic had shifted. The agencies were pushing that something needed to be done with Ukraine. Of course, Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was directly addressing legislators in Washington. And a number of Republicans, so not just Senate Republicans, but House Republicans, began to tell Johnson, it's really time to move now.
Just on the Republicans and where they stand on Ukraine, I mean, it was really striking. There was a headline, I think, in the New York Post earlier this week showing Marjorie Taylor Greene wearing a Russian hat, implying that she's some kind of Russian stooge. Do they mind the accusations of being an apologist for Vladimir Putin, or does that just bounce off them?
It does for Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, I think, first of all, 101 House Republicans voted for the package, 112 voted against, almost an even split. And I think almost for those 112, you almost have to go on a case by case basis in terms of why they voted the way they did. In the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene, it is a case of a woman who is a conspiracy theorist. She's aligned with the QAnon movement. She has talked about Jews who fire space lasers, for example. She has really no set defined positions on foreign policy. She just likes to get attention. And it's as simple as that. She's relatively new in Congress coming out of Georgia, but she has high hopes for herself. And in the 21st century environment, she is the type of person who can suck the oxygen out of the room because she'll say something provocative, absolutely to the walls, sometimes batshit crazy, if you don't mind that phrase, and she knows she'll get headlines for it. Um, she, I think, has thought, well, look, my mileage here is to stand up, and she's one of a number of legislators who do this by saying, oh, why do we give money to Ukraine? It's all wasted over there. We'll spend it on Americans over here. And she'll say that she goes even further and says, oh, well, this isn't a Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is a Western war. This is an American and a NATO war against Ukraine. So I don't think she's a Kremlin puppet. In other words, I don't think she's part of the Kremlin's disinformation campaign, which is extensive, by the way, and has bought out some politicians. I don't think she's part of that immediate campaign, but she's just happy to parallel the Kremlin's talking points for her own personal agenda.
But Donald Trump has a point, doesn't he, Scott? When he says, and okay, his language may be very irresponsible, but when he talks about NATO countries, particularly in Europe, needing to increase their defense spending, the number of NATO countries who still are not meeting the 2% of GDP defense spending target, he's right, isn't he?
Well, I mean, Donald, there's a case of a blind squirrel that finds an acorn every once in a while. And the fact is that, the issue of NATO countries spending 2% on GDP predates Trump. It was a pledge made in 2014 at the NATO summit in Wales. It just so happened that Trump made this his personal bandwagon, as it were, to say, "Oh, I'm the guy that will get them to spend the 2%. If they don't, I will punish them." It was a case of the showman, Trump, the showman, manipulating an issue in part because he's hostile to European countries. If they don't bow down to him, and then make it his own. So you have to sort of almost separate Trump from the immediate issue of NATO and say, yeah, look, the 2% issue is very much there. It was exacerbated by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But as Jens Stoltenberg pointed out earlier this year, more than half of the 30 countries, well, now 32 countries, of course, because Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, more than half have now met the 2% target or are close to doing so. So it is something that is happening. And in fact, at a wider level, Vladimir Putin's gamble, we talked about it before, that failed was he could break NATO, he could break Europe. He's actually energized NATO to a large extent. So I think the issue of collective defense is at the forefront. And in fact, has been even more at the forefront for European countries that we have to do something precisely because of Trump, because he is unreliable, because he's unpredictable, because he has threatened to pull out of NATO, which means that there are plans now alongside NATO for European countries to sort of ramp up their own collective defense organizations. But on Trump, while we're on it, Trump, and this story may have gone by the boards, a lot of people, was part of the story as to why the shift occurred last week. And it is a classic Trump story of what happened. Donald Trump had come out and had objected to the aid to Ukraine. He did shift a little bit and say, oh, any money that we give Ukraine has to be in the form of loans and they have to pay us back, right? Otherwise, they're taking our money. And he maintained that line until last week. And then, I don't know if you noticed it or if other you noticed, he shifted. He shifted, I think, on Thursday, which was right as the procedural votes were being put in place for the final decision on Saturday. And he went out and said that Ukraine should be supported. Now, the question is, why did Trump say that? And so here's one where we can get a bit of an edge on other media outlets that didn't really go to that. We know that David Cameron visited Trump a few weeks ago. And there were a lot of headlines at that point. The British Foreign Secretary goes out there. We don't know. We never knew exactly what they talked about, but Ukraine's probably part of it, right? Andres Duda went out there at the start of last week. Now, he's not as well known in the UK as David Cameron, but he's the president of Poland. The Poles have always flattered Trump, especially Duda's party, which is the Law and Justice Party, which is the hard right party in Poland. And they even talked about naming an American base in Poland as Fort Trump, and so they've always played up to Trump. Duda went to Trump and said, "We've always worked with you. You've always been great for us. We're threatened by the Russians, and Ukraine's threatened by the Russians as well. You've got to realize it." And lo and behold, because of that transactional politics, and Trump doesn't think in terms of foreign policy, doesn't think in terms of big strategy things. He thinks about, what do Donald Trump, get out of this? Trump flipped. And of course, when Trump flipped, not every Republican, but some Republican congressmen probably shifted just a bit before Saturday's vote.
And so do you think, Scott, that change in position from Donald Trump is a permanent thing, or do you think this is a one-off?
No, it depends on his ego. It absolutely depends on his ego. This is the same man who blackmailed Ukraine in 2019 and froze military aid. And remember that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, not in a direct military way, but in a way of giving assistance, giving leadership to separatist groups, goes back to 2014. Donald Trump in 2019 cut off military aid to Ukraine because they wouldn't dish dirt on Joe Biden, who was then one of the Democratic candidates for president. It was as simple as that. So Trump had a hostility towards Zelensky and the Ukrainian government because of that. He was hostile towards the Ukrainian government as well because Rudy Giuliani had gone over there, worked with a whole set of Ukrainian politicians and officials who actually were part of the disinformation campaign to try to undo Biden. And Zelensky and the government, gave short shrift to those people. Like I said, though, 2024, Trump, it doesn't have white focus. It's like, what's good for me now? What's good for me this year? And you get the Duda visit, and he shifts a bit. And I think, and there had been messages from Zelensky as well. Zelensky had played up to Trump as well in different ways. We really want him to understand how important this is, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a different message coming out of Kyiv. What happens if Trump becomes an elected president? I know if you want to go that far, that's a complete wild card situation, though. And I think there's absolutely no guarantee that Trump will be on board with continued assistance to Ukraine. And even if he was, it won't be in a coherent, organized way, which is why for the past few months, the Europeans have been ramping up aid to Ukraine precisely because the United States could not necessarily be counted upon. Initiatives such as getting more shells to Ukraine, that's being led by the Czechs. Discussions still going on far too slowly about getting more air defenses to Ukraine. Discussions about getting economic and financial aid to Ukraine, which was confirmed with the 50 billion through 2027 earlier this year by the European Union.
And of course, it's very easy to get distracted by the political drama in Washington about this. But as you outlined there, Scott, I mean, the need for this aid is so immediate. You look at, for example, the threat that Kharkiv is coming under at the moment. You look at speculation of a Russian ground offensive in the late spring, early summer. I mean, this is urgent.
Yeah, I think where we were, because, and I know our YouTube friends are going to come in here like they always do. And some of them always said, oh, Russia will win. Russia will always win. The reality was up until the end of 2023, Ukraine had the initiative. Now it was moving very slowly on the eastern and southern fronts, but it had the initiative. But as Vladimir Zelensky said this week, after the U.S. vote, he said, we lost that initiative. We lost that initiative. And what this means is, first of all, that we can check the Russians, because where we were, the Russians, again, were still not taking a huge amount of ground in the east. But what they were doing is that they were taking some villages. They were slowly making them move, especially in the Donetsk region towards a place called Chasiv Yar, which is a very important strategic position. And there was a threat they could take Chesapeake. There still is, which is there. And at the same time, they were ramping up the aerial assaults, especially as you mentioned on Kharkiv. Now, Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city, 1.3 million people. It's about 30 kilometers, 19 miles from the Russian border. It had withstood in 2022. The Russians wanted to grab it in 2022, and along with the defense of Kyiv, that was a huge success story in preventing Putin getting a quick victory. Well, here we are 2 years later, and what the Russians have been doing is trying to wipe out the energy infrastructure around Kharkiv. And those have been very devastating attacks. They've taken out thermal power plants as well as conventional power plants. Yesterday, they took out the television tower, snapped it in half. So, what they're trying to do is not only break the infrastructure, they're trying to break civilian resistance. Had the U.S. aid not been forthcoming, it's not just a military question, it's a psychological issue that I think Kharkiv would have been under that threat. This wasn't just simply Ukraine crying wolf to get the assistance. This was very much a reality. I mean, I've got a lot of friends who work in the security and the military communities, and I would say probably since February was when the alarm started sounding. It wasn't as much that the Russians had taken out Divka. That wasn't that important a town. It was the fact that the Russians were able to gather more shells, put more shells out there, and it was the use of guided bombs. Something we could talk about maybe in a later program, why they're so important. What it meant was the Russians were not exposing their aircraft to air defenses because the guided bombs could be fired from a further distance away and then directed towards some of these targets, including the energy infrastructure up in the Northeast.
How do you think Vladimir Putin will have looked on over the weekend and viewed the passing of this aid? Will he have almost grown optimistic from his point of view that this package would never have passed? And what is his next move?
All you have to do is track Russian state television. And even if you don't speak Russian, there's a couple of great accounts on social media. Julia Davis is one. Francis Scar of BBC Monitoring is another. And up until a few days ago, the House Republicans were like Russian state TV's favorite people, as well as Trump. It was like, these are the guys, you know, we can count on them. They're going to make sure the U.S. stays out of the fight. And at the same time, they're saying, we're going to take Kharkiv. We're going to take Kharkiv. And when we get Kharkiv, we're going to go further. That, by the way, for those folks, the Peace Now activists out there, just want to let you know that the Russian state message is not, we were going to take Kharkiv, then we were going to negotiate to end this. It was, then we're going to move on other areas like Odessa down in the south. And some of them saying, we'll take the entire country. As soon as it became clear that the House was going to pass the aid package, and of course the U.S. Senate will then confirm that passage this week before Joe Biden signs it, then it switched from optimism to anger and deep concern. And all of a sudden, the House Republicans who switched and voted for the package have become traitors. They're not going after Trump. They still think they can get Trump back, as it were, right? So they're not going after Trump. But what's interesting is they're going after House Republicans generally, and they're praising Marjorie Taylor Greene. To come back to what we talked about earlier, the number one Republican legislator who is being promoted by the Russians now is MTG because they think she's the disruptor. I should add that it's not just a case of Marjorie Taylor Greene objecting to Ukraine aid. She, along with two other legislators, Thomas Massey of Kentucky, Paul Gosar of Arizona, are threatening. They're trying to bring a motion to the House floor to remove Mike Johnson as Speaker. Now, just at this point, there's only three of them. But the Russians are hoping that effort will snowball because, of course, they see Mike Johnson as being their ultimate traitor in terms of in terms of the congressional politics, since he switched sides in the last few days.
What is fascinating is that in interviews, Vladimir Putin says that he would rather have Joe Biden in the White House after the next election. And is that purely him being mischievous, Scott, or is there actually some truth that he sees Biden actually as more of a rational actor and that, he fears Trump's unpredictability?
Oh, he's stirring because remember when he said it. That's the key thing about this. This occurred, I think, back in February. And you might remember that before Biden's State of the Union address, which has actually changed the narrative around the election, the run up to this in February was that Joe Biden was, poor memory, that he was absolutely losing it, uh, that he was going to collapse on the campaign trail, all of which is untrue for reasons we could talk about. But the U.S. media had bought into this narrative, which the Trumpists had been pitching for years. And so Biden looked to be almost done for in terms of the U.S. media, or much of the U.S. media at that point. And what Putin thought he could do is he could pile in and say, oh, I'm backing Biden here. And then those center voters in the United States, those voters who are not necessarily pro-Trump or anti-Trump, they might say, "Oh, if Putin is supporting Biden, maybe Trump isn't so bad." And also, it means that Putin could superficially cover up Russia's, continued attempts to interfere in the U.S. elections, which are on behalf of Trump, because he could always point to that statement and say, "Well, our trolls, our bots. What are you talking about? All these accounts that support Donald Trump? No, no, no. Look at me. I said Joe Biden was the guy I preferred."
That's so interesting. Where do you see things going in the next few months, Scott? I mean, this is such a big question, but I mean, in terms of the aid that's been approved, do you think we will see a material difference on the front line, or do you think, for the time being at least, the immediate priority for Ukraine remains just holding ground?
The immediate priority in one aspect of this war, and we'll go to the others in just a second, but in one aspect of this war is holding the front line. Um, and I should say, as part of that, that in preparation for the possibility that the aid could go through, the U.S. military and other agencies had moved um, some of the American weapons into European storehouses. So some of those weapons don't have to come all the way from the United States. They don't have to be produced, from scratch. They can be moved to the front line within weeks. How much we're still waiting to see. But yeah, the priority is shoring up the front line in the east, and that means getting more shells there. It means getting more other weapon systems there, and it also means getting air defense in there, right? And of course, that's air defense not just for the east, but for other parts of the country, because of course the Russians, for example, are trying to knock out the port facilities in Odessa. So you get all of that in there at the same time that Europe is ramping up its own assistance to Ukraine. And then what you do is if the Russians, the window for the Russians is whether they can try to mount that offensive that you're talking about before a lot of the aid gets there. So I think we're really talking now of a window which is the rest of the spring. I think if you get into June and July and the Russians haven't made the push, uh, Ukraine's going to take not going to completely breathe easier, but it's going to think, all right, first stage, we made it through there. Then I think when you go through the summer and the autumn, then you got to match it up to the other phases that are taking place here. Remember that Ukraine, while it's been having to be on the defensive on the front line, has been hitting the Russians hard, really hard, behind the front lines. Again, just to reiterate, and because they knocked out another warship a few days ago. Now, it wasn't the most important warships; it was a recovery vessel. But that, and by the way, the oldest Russian warship on active service in the world, for trivia buffs out there. The fact is Ukraine's knocked out almost a third of the Black Sea fleet. And that's pretty significant. And as we said, that broke Russia's grip on part of the Black Sea already. They have hit Russian air bases. Significantly, they hit a whole series of Russian oil refineries. Now, they had paused those attacks, interestingly, at the start of April, because there was noise from the Biden administration, which was, stop it, we don't want you hitting the oil refineries. But interestingly, I won't get into the ins and outs here, but I think there's some connection here. As soon as the aid package was on its way to passing the House, Ukraine carried out its first significant attacks on Russian infrastructure since the start of April. And they were major attacks. They hit oil depots and they hit electricity substations, right? So they have the potential to ramp those up. The Americans, as part of the aid, it's not confirmed, but it has been recommended by the House that the aid package include long-range missile systems. They're called ATACMS systems, ATAC systems. So up to this point, the Americans had limited those systems to, I think, 165 kilometers in range. The new systems, if the administration goes ahead with the supply, are up to 300 kilometers in range. I think they'll come with the proviso that you cannot use them to hit Russian territory, but you can hit Russian occupied territory with them, which is significant in areas like Crimea. So that aspect is that if Ukraine can degrade Russian capabilities behind the front lines, it then affects, of course, the front lines. It affects the front lines itself, affects the Russian economy as well. And that's the other aspect of this which is Russia continues to try to superheat the economy to try to escape the grip of the sanctions. They have been partially successful in escaping the grip of the sanctions, but not completely successful in doing so. There is still a great deal of economic pressure on Russia. So for them to keep on trying to ramp up the production and for them to keep on producing the manpower to try to break through the Ukrainian front lines, that's also in play here. If we get to the autumn, where you have a combination of the front lines have stabilized and where Ukraine's able to hit the Russians behind the front lines, then I think, and at least this is the way Zelensky's talking, then you look at the prospect of, can we regain the initiative again and put pressure on the Russians the way that they did, of course, with the counteroffensive in the autumn of 2022 roughly through the summer of 2023, which takes us all the way around. You and I talked about this. Not a sprint. This is not a sprint. It is still a marathon. And what was significant here is are you in it? Are you in it for the marathon? The big thing about the U.S. aid, symbolically, is that the Americans wouldn't be in for the long haul. Now, we still don't know if they're in for the long haul because we still got the elections to come up. But at least it means they're in there for the next few laps. And that was significant, of course, because we're talking part of an international effort. If the Americans are back in, then it's going to bolster the Europeans. It's going to bolster other countries like Canada, Japan, Australia. And it's going to weaken the Russian propaganda line. Because all along, just a quick reminder, especially to the pro-Kremlin activists out there, Putin's play in February 2022 was that no one would come to the defense of Ukraine, that he would attack, he would break Ukraine within a few weeks, and the West would either choose not to help Ukraine or it would not it would not rally itself in time. He failed. He failed with that. But what he was thinking is, maybe I can do it in 2024. And symbolically, that U.S. aid package, when it's probably signed by Joe Biden on Friday, is going to be a big defeat to that immediate ambition that Putin had.
Professor Scott Lucas, always appreciate your insight and your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you. Stay safe, stay sane.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.